welcome to our March edition of Adiva's Fireside Chats. Today with me I have Vanja Josifovski, who is a very special guest, not only because he's former CTO of Airbnb and Pinterest, but also because he also comes from Macedonia, and a lot of people in our engineering community here look up to him, and we're really looking forward to learn from his experience. So yeah, Vanja, it's a great pleasure to have you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Just to add before we start with the discussion, for those of you who are here for the first time, our fireside chats are happening monthly, so for something more than a year now. And they're part of the broader vision of Adiva to enable work without boundaries by allowing people across the world to learn from leaders in the industry like Vanja today and our past speakers. Someone from my team will share a link to sli.do where you can post your questions. We will circle back to that at the end of the discussion and try to answer as many as possible. It's a good idea also to rate the questions. That would help us prioritize them in case there are too many and we are not able to go through everything. Okay, so Vanja, let's start with a quick introduction from yourself, and then we can dive into the discussion.
Well, first, thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm in California. It's morning for me. I assume for most of you, it's probably evening or afternoon. And thanks for taking time from your evening to be here and listen to me. Because thanks for inviting me to be here. И здраво на света от Македония. Драго е къде днеска че поразговараме. All right, so who am I? I was born in Skopje. I left Macedonia fairly early, around 87. I guess most of you were born probably after that. Went through a few different countries, actually landed in America in early 2000 in the Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area. Got a job at IBM when IBM was the company that was doing software. Silicon Valley started as hardware shop first, and then software was considered a secondary kind of a business, but then over time software and then the internet took over, so I kind of moved from one company to another, kind of following the trend. So from IBM I went to Yahoo, spent about 6 years there, and then I went to Google before starting a small company that got acquired by Pinterest. In Pinterest I landed about 2015. I became a CTO, eventually running engineering and tech, and from there I went to Airbnb when I ran about half of engineering product and had some general manager responsibility for certain areas like marketplace and so on. I left Airbnb about a week ago to start a new venture. I won't be able to talk about that today. It's prior to announcement. So yeah, here we are.
Maybe we can talk a bit more about that on some future event.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
Great, thanks for the introduction. You've had vast experience in major tech companies, not only as CTO, but before that, as your career progressed. What are the things that Silicon Valley companies do better than all of us? What do they understand more? And now that you're an advisor for startups, some things that from your experience you can pass on to companies of any size, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the world is equalizing, right? In the last few years, I'm seeing more and more companies started in other places, and I think, the change of the world that Corona induced on us is accelerating that. I feel, the history of Silicon Valley is, you have some great schools, and specifically Stanford and Berkeley here, that spawn, and California has this entrepreneurship tradition that goes all the way to 1849 with the gold rush. People came here, and those were very special people that came from the other side of the continent here to find some gold. And I think some of that mentality has stayed here in the valley. And so good schools, entrepreneurial, fearless kind of mentality of the people spawn the valley. I think what happened is that furnace, that reinforcement cycle, where at some point in every company and every market space and everything, you need to get that network effect and going on. And I think that happened in the valley. here by having a different work culture and honestly a different mentality, very egalitarian mentality in some ways, very result-focused mentality as well, which wasn't really sure outside the Valley. Even in America, in other corporate cultures like in IBM, there were established ways of doing things. It was a lot more hierarchical. That kind of built the Valley, and I think that's what at the core of it here is that, you know, people just feel there is opportunity, and if you have optimism, you know, and capital and talent, things usually happen. You know, lately it's become a lot harder here in terms of talent and hiring. Honestly, compensation has gone through the roof in many different ways, and I think that's at this point burdening the Valley, although it's, you know, probably the largest incubator in the world. But I believe other places, including, you know, Eastern Europe and Macedonia and so on, have some advantages in that aspect, that you know, the hiring is not as constrained here, as far as I know. I'm not very familiar with the Macedonian market, though I might be wrong. So yeah, it's a unique combination of mentality, capital, talent, focused in one place that I think is driving the innovation here.
So maybe talent and capital is not something we can influence, but the mindset is definitely something everyone is able to change.
Yeah, I mean, to make $1 billion company, you first have to believe that you'll make $1 billion company. Right?
Exactly.
And usually you'll be the only believer because everybody else won't believe that. So you got to believe in presence of skepticism from everybody else, right? And I think, yeah, I would say that most of the founders I've worked with, you know, that achieve that level of success and higher, you know, if you ask them at this point, they obviously harbored some insecurities and never thought they will make it, but they did, and it kind of, you know, the belief drove them forward. And, you know, at some point, if you say things enough times, you start believing them yourself. So positive, you have positive thoughts, and good things will happen, right?
Great. And what are the things that you know, are the top priorities you take when you advise a startup? I mean, from your past experience, what are the things you pass on to the startups that you advise in terms of organizing the team, maybe setting up the engineering structure, anything you feel relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I don't take a lot of advisorships at this point, but when I talk to companies, I'm trying to see what are the concrete things I can help with. And so first, you want to see the opportunity, and you want to see the founding team and make sure that you work with people that will take advice. Because, you know, some people listen to your advice, but they don't take it. And so you need to find people that will take advice and apply it in practice. And I think that's the first thing I'm looking for. I'm looking for a marketplace or something that seems interesting that will change industry, you know, be it how people think about mental health, or be it how people think about makeup and videos. And, you know, those are some examples of companies I advise, you know, some infrastructure companies where it's more on a technical side, but look for some new angle into doing things and something interesting. And then I try to focus on, you know, a couple different areas, either building or retaining people, so that, you know, helping hire, helping interview, helping connect people. I'm not very good at sourcing, you know, talent. My network is a little bit more senior at this point, you know. I'm a little bit older, but you know, evaluating people that I do with some companies. Other companies I do technical advising in terms of technology, you know, search systems, AI. I'm still at the core a technical person. So although in the last few years I did more of a management kind of jobs, and we can talk a little bit about that, what it means to be a CTO. Yeah, and then honestly, you know, doing small companies requires some personal therapy, you know, because times get tough. And I think one of the more important things to build a company is to be able to take rejections, and those are hard some of the days. So it depends on the company. Yeah.
We can dig in to the things that you mentioned, like evaluating people and engineering structure and all of that. But yes, let's see first, how does a day of a CTO in Airbnb or Pinterest look like? What are also, what are some challenges that you faced there?
Yeah, I mean, every company is different. It's almost like companies have personalities, right? And so a personality is not something you can describe in a sentence or two, right? I mean, we all have certain features, and but once you reach a certain scale, like 1,000 people, or I think my teams came close to 2,000 at some point, then the team, the CTO has two type of support teams. So one team are the technical organizational people that report, that's sub-organizations, and so you have managers, directors, VPs that manage those organizations. And then you have the technical talent, some of that reports directly to the CTO in my case. So these are my top tier uber technical leads, architects, wherever you call them, fellows level kind of talent. That's where the work is done. And in addition to that, usually at that scale, you have a different support team, and that's administrative team, usually a chief of staff, HR partner, program management, and all of that. So I think, a lot of CTOs, including myself, as you go through the rank, and I stayed on the technical side a little bit longer than most, we focus on the first type of a team, and this is the team that does work. Actually, to be successful, you have to have this other type of a team that's your that kind of surrounds you and helps you manage the day, helps you manage the communication, because at that level, work is mostly communicating. Okay, so you need to communicate to the team. You need to communicate why are we doing what we're doing. You need to communicate how we're doing what we're doing. That's planning. And you need to make sure that you communicate accountability. So when you come to that level, one of the common mistakes I've seen, especially for people coming up through the technical side, is they keep being focused on the technical stuff. And that happened to me as well at some point. And once in a while, I'll get really into some of the technical work, and that usually will result in slowing everybody down, because at that point I have least context. That people work for weeks before they present to you something, and then if you start digging into stuff, it takes a while, and you slow, and everybody responds to you because they all want to make sure that they answer the questions. Usually slows down things. So it's really important to build the support team, and they do a lot of stuff for you. They prepare the communications, internal, external communications. They point you out to the parts of the organization that needs attention. They help you with restructuring the team, because as companies' priorities move, you have to kind of change everything on. So it's an ongoing process, and it's mostly communicating, planning, organizational stuff, and so on at that point. So when you ask me how you spend the day is usually 10 to 12 hours of back-to-back meetings. Sometimes those meetings are like 30 minutes, and it's a completely different context. So you talk about one thing 30 minutes, and then next thing you're in a different room, and you just need to, you got 15 seconds to pick yourself up and understand what's going on there. And then from there on, and the day's gone. So I think, even at that level, it's like really important that you manage your time very efficiently, I would say. But yeah, it gets brutal sometimes. And that was my life for 7 years until recently.
Yeah, you're now going for a kind of a vacation with the new startup, I guess.
I wouldn't call it a vacation.
Compared to what you had.
Starting a
No,
company,
it's a different set of challenges. Okay, let's talk a bit about the organization of the engineering teams on a lower level. So you mentioned 2,000 people. How are they communicating between themselves? What's the structure when you get to that kind of a level in a company?
That's a more complex question. It does go into a lot of details. Usually you don't, there's two ways. So usually you don't build an organization of that size, right? It takes years to build it. So usually you inherit an organization of that side. I mean, I inherit an organization of smaller side, but or you have an organization of one size and somebody, and then you get another organization, so you kind of add it. So it's not like, what I'm saying is you almost never start from scratch, and that and that influences to some extent what you do with the organizations, because even smaller organization on a scale of 100 people, they have their own culture, they have their own ways, and there is no one right or wrong way to organize things. If I've learned something about organizations, is that there's many different ways to succeed and make it work, and there is many different ways to mess it up and make it completely dysfunctional. There's usually not a single way to do this, and as such, usually what you need to do when you get an organization is to understand what are the strong cultural facets of it, what kind of identity the team has, and then find a reasonable, pragmatic way to move it forward without scrambling all the eggs once again, because that never works. And some organizations have stronger identities, some organizations weaker identities, some organizations are more homogeneous, others are much more diverse. What happens over time is that you have to unify processes, and the processes are here to make sure that everybody understands what people need to do, and that has to be very clear. And then the processes are there to enforce accountability. It's like, who has achieved the work and why at some point of level. But there is no, I mean, some leaders, they have a very set way of how you build teams, while I've always been a little bit more pragmatic. For example, in the Valley, there are two different ways of treating data scientists versus engineers. So sometimes it's embedded, that's the Google model. In other places, it's separate, like in Airbnb, and for example. And so there is a lot of almost religious favor of how you should organize these things. And the reality is that, there are successful examples of both ways. So now, coming into an environment where it's one way or another, and trying to change that will get you a lot of ill will from the team at the point where you probably cannot afford it. And so that's another thing. Every restructuring, every change, it has an impact on the team, and you have to space those out. You cannot just do change after change. People want to understand and have some predictability in things. So it's not like, I have a little bit of OCD, and I clean at home all the time, but attempting to do that with teams, that would be my first instinct. I always pick up after the kids and clean up stuff because it bothers me. But attempting to do that at work will be catastrophic. So I have to resist that instinct. Yeah.
Was it hard to get used to a mindset change like that?
I mean, I think over time my work persona and my private persona are pretty different, right? It's in many different ways, and it has to do something with the Balkan mentality too, that you have to be yourself, and you cannot always say what you think, right? I mean, what comes to your mind, not which thing that comes to mind, but there's many different ways in which the work environment is different and requires us to grow and change to be able to function fully at work. Yeah.
Right. And when it comes to evaluating engineers and the success of the teams or the productivity, what are some ways for measuring the performance? What are some evaluation metrics that, like, as tips to other teams or engineering managers?
Yeah, I mean, going back to my pragmatic approach, I've seen cultures where this is very, deliberate and precise and numerically driven. Like IBM used to rank everybody, so you get a rank of the whole team. Now, I think, and some of this is almost like driven by the current trends. Like the current trend in HR is not to do that anymore. It used to be, 15, 20 years. You can have scales that are very detailed, from 1 to 10, and you rank everybody on the scale. You can have scales that are, pretty broad. Like, I would say the current trend in the Valley is to have like 3 or 4 different buckets. Meet some expectations, meet all expectations, exceeds expectation, and sometimes greatly exceeds expectation, right? So that's a very broad buckets, and I think that's where we are today. I think more importantly, as managers, and especially with direct reports, than calibrating people, I think focus and calibration is actually the wrong focus, because that happens once or twice a year, and by that time it's too late. To really manage teams, you have to pay attention to them on a continuous basis. We spend a lot of time at work, all of us, and we're all professionals, and we take a lot of pride in our profession. And so I think beyond calibration, empathy and understanding, and making sure that your team members feel that as a manager, you're here to help them personally, is more important than calibration. And that comes with being able to give them frank feedback, and to tell them when things are not going well, with empathy, not and the way people say things is very, very important. So I'm not a fan of transactional calibration, doing it once a year. I'm a fan of continuous kind of work with people. And that's why when I have teams, I don't take a lot of direct reports, because every direct report requires attention and time and care. And I think that works the best. But when I would get new teams or new reports, I would learn about each individual organization, but I will also put time to learn about the personal goals of every one of my new reports. What do they want in life? Like, they want a new house, they want to buy a pool for their kid or whatnot. I wanted to understand that part, because kind of work and personal goals are kind of all connected, and we really need to put some time to understand people, and rather than just come at the end of the cycle and just look at the results and so on. So that's kind of a broad answer to a broad question as well.
And because it takes a lot of time, how many direct reports do you think is ideal for one manager to have?
Cray supercomputers, they still exist today, and actually they do some interesting technology. But in the 90s, Cray said the perfect team is a team of 1. But since I can't do it myself, I have a team of 12. So I use the number 12 often to kind of the number of reports. But obviously in companies, sometimes you diverge from that, because things change on a continuous basis. So yeah.
Or as many people as can share a pizza?
Yeah, that's a pizza team. That's 7, I think. Yeah.
8.
8, yeah.
Okay, and when it comes to releasing new features, so more on the technical side, maybe what you did at Airbnb or any past company, something that you think is a good approach, planning and releasing new features. How does that work in the large companies?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, companies are very different. So actually, companies, when you look at companies per se, and maybe diverging a little bit from your question, is that different companies are very different and very similar at the same time. And that sounds paradoxical, but actually is mathematically correct in a large dimensional space. And if you have things that, let me get to my math background a little bit, but things that make sense in normal dimensional space, like up to 3 dimensions, do not make sense in a large dimensional space. And actually, for companies, they can be both very similar and very different, because there's just so many facets to kind of work through. And so in terms of delivery and the rhythm of execution and how you deliver the features, it depends on the character of the company, and the character of the company depends usually on the character of the founders, as well as the domain where you are. The domain determines a lot of things. Like Airbnb is a company that's really connected to the real world. Like, we strive to make sure everybody's safe, things are working well, and so on. If you have an ad-driven company, if something goes wrong, your system goes down, some of the ads are not shown, but it's a different kind of a threshold of reaction and whatnot. And so in companies where you have bigger margin for things to kind of go slide off a little bit, you have more opportunity to do things in a planned way because you have less interrupts from the real world. And so I think for the teams, the best thing is to be able to always work in a planned environment. You make a plan and then you execute on the plan. The plan can be a scrum for 2 weeks, or it could be a 6 months plan, or so on, right? And so I think find a way to give the team the most predictability they need, that you can afford, right? So if you can make things predictable for 6 months, then do that. Resist to change things all the time. Look on the outside, see what really matters. Induce change only when you have to. Usually you get the highest productivity, in that way. Now, in terms of how you determine what to build, there is this eternal fight between using intuition and using data, right? and obviously, in most of the cases, what you can measure is the only real thing that will bring improvement. And a lot of the internet cultures of the Valley have been built on that, cycle of measuring and deploying. But usually that's a very, very short-sighted kind of cycle. You will have to not everything is measurable. And then what you need to do is you have competition, and they'll leapfrog you if they try things that you're not willing to try, only because they're not measurable. So that's a hard one. Determining exactly what features you should develop takes a combination of crafting the right experiments and at some point just driving forward with the intuition you have, making sure that you measure everything you measure, but you don't get stuck to that, and just do things that you can only measure.
Okay. Right. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Airbnb. All they did was follow what people thought they needed, right?
Yeah. No, and I think that's an example of a company that they probably got hundreds of times the opinion that nobody would like to be at somebody else's home, and apparently the world just went there, right? And they measure it because at that time nobody was doing that, right?
Yep. Okay, more on the technical side. We have 2 more questions, and then we'll jump to the questions from the audience. I see that there are a lot of on sli.do coming up. Yeah. First thing, modern data stack. What is it all about?
Yeah, so the modern data stack, in its narrowest term, refers to the technologies to ingest data, usually from your apps and logs, and then move them to the place where you can analyze data. It's largely analytics, so it's warehouses, data lakes, and then ETL, ELT, loading it all up, and then the reverse of that, which is taking data from your warehouse environment and then moving it into your tooling so that it can be accessible with the right business owner. So at large, the modern data stack is about analytics. So when I was working on databases some 20-something years back, the thinking was that all the transactional, still have today transactional databases like Oracle and IBM and whatnot, and they're usually at the core of running the systems, and they're the ground truth of what's happening. And so the idea was that analytics will be done into those cores. But transactional kind of access patterns are very different than analytics. Analytics is usually about aggregation over larger slices of data, and so that never worked there. And so that's what spun off, and the cloud spun off kind of the the modern data stack, which is about providing analytics and getting it to the right places. I feel that the cloud kind of came out almost by accident, to the world. I mean, largely the story goes that Google started in '99 or something around there, and they didn't have enough money to buy an IBM machine to do the indexing, so they decided to try to do this with cheaper hardware, and they did. And then they published a MapReduce paper that came out, and then but MapReduce was never intended to be used by anybody outside of Google. So I think in terms of usability, the cloud is still extremely hard to use for and it's almost a step back from the time of having mainframes when everything was integrated and built the same company. So we still have a long way to go, and I think the modern data stack will it has a decade or so of evolution to the point where it'll be really easy to use, because I assume that a lot of you have jobs because it's not easy to use today, right?
True.
So that's the story of the modern data stack. Yeah.
And in terms of AI trends, I know that you're working with AI a lot and advising a lot of startups. Not sure what the next thing from you coming up is, but I'm guessing it will have to do with AI as well. What are some things you can share about the trends in AI?
Yeah, so I'll be working in the cloud AI area, so that's coming up in a month or so. I would say, just as with analytics, I think AI in the cloud is extremely hard these days. I mean, so AI is a very broad field, right? I mean, I think if you look at the last decade, and if you look at what happened in AI, is basically is the triumph of the scaling approaches, right? So if you look over the maybe last 2 decades in AI, there were 2 somewhat different approaches to things. And one is like they just add models with more parameters, figure out how to scale them, figure out how not to overfit them, and the problem will be solved. And so the other approaches was more mathematically structured. Is like, let's assume that the world is a sample of a certain distribution, and so we will figure out those distributions, and then it's like almost like Plato's ideal circle in the sky, and then everything is built around that, and so more elegant mathematically, but a somewhat more complex approach. So the scaling side won, right? So it's like if you look at the neural net approaches of today, they have less of math and more of a brute force, and representation and learning, which is what made the advances in vision and speech and so on. It's just like adding a layer after layer, and instead of manually designing those features, it goes all the way from pixels to the models, and it's a lot of trial and error. It's like you randomize your examples, you do this type of architecture, you cut out the parameters here. It's almost ad hoc. So our more mathematically inclined colleagues almost kind of frown on everything else on there, but it is what it is, and we made these advances because the hardware advanced mostly. The advances in the algorithms themselves are much slower, and if you look at those papers, they have some math, but if you trace the lineage of the math, you can find out over the 5 years that's not really changing. So where does it go from here? I mean, it's gonna be the game of scale, and I think it's gonna go forward. I mean, there is some approaches like transformers in NLP and so on that are very interesting. However, one notable thing is that the advances in vision and speech have not translated into making AI over cloud data any easier. I mean, today, if you want to do AI over cloud data, you still have to do basically, you need the data engineering team to pull it out and munge it, and then you have to create all these features and so on. So I'm expecting that that's going to get a lot easier. Yeah, I would say that.
Great. Let's go to the audience questions. The first one is, what was the tech stack behind Airbnb? And compared to Pinterest, which one had more challenging architecture?
Oh, I think both have challenging architectures, and in a very different ways. I think the Pinterest stack is more in line, again, the domain determines the differences here. So Pinterest is more in line with the advertising scenario. And the advertising scenario is you have this gazillion low content events. And this is not only for Pinterest, but for everybody else in the Valley, from LinkedIn to Google to Facebook and so on. And a lot of the cloud technology was built for this scenario, including MapReduce and TensorFlow and whatnot. You have this huge amount of data, but each individual event is relatively low in semantics and content. So it's like, because a view of an ad, for example, if you view an ad, the meaning of that is much less than if you went to Airbnb and clicked on a property and something like that. So a lot of the technology was built for that and around the Valley. So the Pinterest stack will be in that way. It will require higher scalability. It will require streaming and reconciliation of the streaming data with the batch processing. It will require, a search stack that will work over billions of items of content and ads, in hundreds of millions. So scalability will be the key thing there. And then you have to build the matching algorithms and everything else on the top to be able to extract signal from a high volume of data. And so when you're extracting signal from that type of scenario, most of the models that you use, they have a big chunk of memorization, right? You can afford to show people twice the same thing. If they don't react to it in 2 times, it's, you learn something and then the model memorizes that. Airbnb is a completely different scenario, as the amount of interactions is a lot smaller, which makes it easier from infrastructure, but it makes it a lot harder from learning. And then the whole business process of booking a listing is extremely complicated. So you need to make sure you can find the availability, and that gets really complex. It seems simple, but it's really complicated. You have hotels with hundreds of rooms, you have properties with single room. The whole business rules, cancellation rules, and whatnot is extremely complicated, which results in a service-oriented architecture that is very complex and gets more complex over time. So I would say the advertising case is a simpler from services, is more complicated for scale. This one is more complicated from business processes. It's more complicated for learning because you just don't have all the interactions. It's like none of you will go and click through 1,000 properties to indicate to the system what you like and not. So the domain determines the technical stack and to some extent the organizational structure. But they're both built on cloud, and so on that level, storage, it's similar. Transactional databases will be similar. Then you have data side, which is how you provide the input to the business leadership, to the CFO, what's happening in the business. That would be somewhat more similar. Yeah.
Okay. I think we answered this. Being a CTO in such big companies, what are your day-to-day responsibilities? Mostly communication.
I just want to say that, Airbnb and Pinterest are not big companies, right? they're companies like, a lot bigger than that. So like if you look at Amazon, Google, and so on, that's 3 scales of difference as well. These are rather small companies, I would say. I mean, they're both in a range of 5,000 to 6,000 people, so it's not that big. Yeah.
I mean, still compared to what most of the CTOs work with, it's still large, right?
Okay, then. Yeah.
Okay. What is the most challenging thing when working with a large scale company like Airbnb or Pinterest? So this is something that we also wanted to answer before, but I'm not sure if we got to it. Mm-hmm. So maybe some challenges that happened in the past, or like in the day-to-day, what is the most challenging thing? Something you'd like to share?
Oh, it's a walk in the park, right? There's never a challenge there. At different times, it's different challenges. Like, you at some point you have the scaling challenge, right? So your business is scaling fast, and you need to keep up with the business. Another point, it could be international growth challenge. Like your business is in the US, you need to start growing internationally. You need to start understanding content internationally. You need to make sure you adapt to local regulations and all of that. And that's, I think at the mid level, it's change is probably challenging, right? So it's different ways of change. I mean, Corona comes, it's change, right? I mean, the world kind of pushes that on you, and the company trajectory pushes that on you. In some cases, it's competition that comes in, but you have to respond. And as changing, meaning changing your technology, changing your organization, changing your mindset as well. I think that's what's really challenging. Steady times is always easy, right?
Right. And from tech perspective, like when you were scaling to different countries, like for example in the EU there was GDPR and other regulations like that. How did that affect the technical side of things?
Oh, that affects the technical side of things in a real way. And I think the trends are that if you want to operate internationally, you will have to have different legislations for data storage and processing in different countries. I mean, it's already there. It's already there in China. It's already there in India, and Germany and other places. So I think that's going to make the technical stacks, another order of magnitude in complexity. Like a complex technological stack, like all of these companies, and not only Airbnb, Pinterest, but almost any company on that level, is usually is not built like your feature where you sit down every day, you put the key in and it starts, and you come home and you take the key off and it turns off, right? These tasks are so complicated that they're not restartable. They've evolved over time and they're functioning all the time. Components fail here and there, but in reality, you almost never lose the whole thing. The whole thing is like never comes down. It's hundreds of services, and making them restartable is really, really difficult. And it's a lot of what we have done at both companies where I was, but in other places. But now imagine that you have to run your stack in 15 different places. It's almost never designed or built to run in more than one place. But the regulation, where the trajectory of the regulation is going, is that's what is going to be required, that you be able to kind of start up your stack and run it in 15 places. So that's going to be a real technical challenge. And I think to some extent the cloud providers can alleviate some of this, but I think it's still unclear from a regulatory standpoint what does this means in terms of storage of data in different countries. GDPR and all of that, there's playbooks for that, so that's all doable, that's all understandable, and there's different ways to do those things. I mean, if you have evolved a company, you haven't been careful with tracking the data and where the data goes, eventually you have to anonymize all of your data to comply. When a user tries to has to be deleted, if you don't track where the data has gone, you'll have to anonymize your whole data set. Now that's both computationally expensive, but it's also a loss in signal and whatnot. And that's why if you're a smaller company, just make sure you track where your PI goes, so you can simply delete per user as needed. But there are playbooks for that. There are even companies that come in and help with that. They're auditors, and I think what's known today is easy. What's coming up, it's going to be very interesting complexity, I think.
Hopefully the technology would also grow.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how much this is going to be a technology issue, because and more of an organizational and basic hygiene issue in the companies, and that's almost harder than technology.
True. What are some of the personal traits that a team of people needs to possess to be successful at high performing when working on big projects?
I mean, I'm not a big fan of reading management books, but there is one book called The Advantage that has left a mark on me, and that says the one of the key things in the book is that the team is bigger than the leader, right? And so there's certain norms of behavior within the team that you need to enforce for the team to be a real team. And so, some of the anti-patterns, for example, is you don't want the leader to resolve things by people coming to the leader and talking in one-on-one. It's like, well, that's not working, and this is not like everything that I hear that's about something being broken. The requirement is that either that person, the other person, is in the room, or that person already heard in some forum about this, right? So I think functional teams adhere to certain behavioral norms, and everybody has everybody's welfare in account within the team. It cannot be the one that people are fighting among each other through the leader usually, and even worse if they do it directly. But enforcing those norms, and you can look it up, The Advantage, the book online, is a fairly famous book. It's like describes those kind of behavioral norms within the team. And I've seen things go awry very quickly. Usually it's the high-stake games, and if the behavior is not controlled, you usually get all these anti-patterns that I just discussed, and there's several of those. I mean, but inability, trying politicking and trying to go around other people, not having frank discussions and so on. The radical candor stuff also comes to mind, but you have to be able to say things and tell people. But if you build that dynamics between the team members and they understand that they're to behave in a certain way and to have the overall team health and the overall team delivery as a partnership where everybody is responsible for it, that usually works good.
So it's mostly about being able to work with other people, empathy that you mentioned before.
Well, and setting norms and setting, what matters. It's like, it's not only what your unit will deliver, it's what we all deliver as a team. Okay? And
Right.
setting up the standards of responsibility that everybody is responsible for the overall delivery. And I think that's on the leader as well. Instead of antagonizing, so if I've incident, have some anecdotes from Macedonia development teams where people pride themselves for pushing the workforce as hard as possible and inducing stress and whatnot, and it's just like that doesn't work even in short term and not in midterm and so on. It's like being proud that you have stressed somebody. It's like
Right.
it's the basic level of understanding. You have to make people happy, and because motivated workforce, and especially in this area where there's so much competition, is what makes a successful team. I usually treat all my reports like I work for them, because I need to know what I need to deliver for them, and as well as what they need to deliver to me. And I judge myself based on that, or what I deliver for them at the end of the day.
That's an excellent point. This is a more personal question in terms of your future roles. Like, can we expect, first, congrats on the amazing career in tech. Can we expect some new CTO role in the future in some of the other popular tech companies, or you will focus on consultancy?
No, I'm starting a company. It's a startup. I'll not be going in a similar role as I was before for a while. So I had a startup before that Pinterest acquired. I really enjoyed that, and I want to spend a little more time closer to the technology and working with some interesting new technology. There will be an announcement coming in about a month.
That's interesting. Is that how you ended up in Pinterest?
Yes, Pinterest acquired a startup that I was working on. And that's how I landed at Pinterest. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, what can you share about your new venture that's coming up in a month? This is more like a visionary thing about the next big movement in tech. Like they say, you started with hardware, switched to software, and then the internet in general. What is the next big movement in tech? You mentioned cloud, AI.
My interest around AI and cloud, right? I mean, it's like tech is such a broad kind of a thing. I mean, from from SpaceX launching rockets in the sky, and then to cloud AI. I've decided for now to stay away from rockets. I'm not very good with fire, and I'll stay with cloud AI. So, but that's a really, really broad question. I mean, I think, as I said, I assume that the technology cycle usually, when it starts, it's pretty rudimentary and very hard to use, and you need a lot of expert to use it, and over time it becomes simpler. And usually technologies kind of mature when they're simpler. And I believe in the cloud and AI, we have a decade maybe of work to make it really simpler. And so I would suspect that a lot of ways how we do AI in the cloud will be not recognizable 10 years from now. It will be very, very different. So that's the area I understand. But tech wider, it's fun to watch and see all these things that come up.
Definitely. This is an interesting question. Which management habits would you carry on into your new role? Like, things are different, right? You mentioned startups versus larger companies. Are you going with more informal structure, more structured ones? Assign deadlines for everything? What's the management approach you're going to take with your new venture?
So let's talk. What will I take and what I'm trying not to take? Okay, because it's both, right? I think, as I said, predictability and structure is good. In a smaller company, like up to, things change at about 50, and about 50, you're like being in water and you can't see the bottom anymore, right? It's like you don't know everybody on the team. But up to 50, you can be fairly informal, and you can run a little bit faster, because in smaller venture things are a little bit less known. So it's like walking in the fog. You need to stumble here, then you turn somewhere else, and so on. So it's also changing direction here, and a lot more often than in bigger companies. I do like to have a plan at every point of time. The plan can change, and in small ventures it can change more, because you learn quicker about your environment. It's like a reinforcement learning for those that are in machine learning. But I do like to have a plan at every point of time. Okay, so at every point of time, I want to understand what we're going to deliver in the next 60 days. I think in smaller companies, more than 60 days, it usually does not make sense to have a detailed plan. So you have to have like a vision of how the company would grow from 60, 90, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but you don't have to have like a detailed plan for all of this. It's more of a vision kind of a thing. The other thing, in a large environment, it's all about mentoring and telling people and helping people advance. And so in a smaller companies, you end up talking with external people a lot, and so that instinct of mentoring sometimes doesn't work if you talk to clients, right? So that's something that you probably leave behind, because people are not always inclined to listen to what you think they should do if they're already doing something else. But
right.
So that's a kind of couple things that I think that I'm working on as I'm building the new company.
Great. Do you have your team set up already, or how do you starting?
Let's talk. Let's look at the announcement in a month, right?
Okay. Okay. When it comes to technology, what is your sweet spot and favorite tech?
The thing I did most is search infrastructure. So I built a search indexer and at IBM in like 2005, I think it was, and because IBM was building enterprise search. And then when I went to Pinterest, when I went to Google, I worked on search infra for a little bit as well. And then I went to Yahoo first. Actually, I built another search infra stack, and then I went to Google. I worked on search infra. I came to Pinterest and I wasn't sure what should I do. So I wrote a search infra stack. so I would say, you know, with some things like I'm probably, you know, if I go somewhere else, I don't know what to do. I'll probably write another search infra stack, right? So that's what I know. That's you know, that's fun to do, and yeah.
Okay, one more, and we're running out of time. This is one about progressing in the career from engineer to management role. So what traits do you think an engineer looking to move into management should have?
So look, I think, and at least in the Valley, and I'm a little bit less familiar with the Macedonian environment, I think management is a trap in a lot of ways, right? And take this as a grain of salt. I'm trying to be a little bit controversial here, but I get a lot of people coming to me and say, I want to become a manager, right? And so I feel that it has pros and cons for us being a manager. It's really, you know, it's really easy to become a manager of a small team, right? Because there's many small teams. It's really hard to become a manager of a 100 people team because there's so many 100 people teams in the company. And so when you look at the curve of management in a larger corporation, you have a lot of managers at the bottom level, but then it's kind of gets, you know, much tighter up there at director level, for example, in the Valley, which is 50 to 100 people, just like so many roles. And so people get stuck. And so that's why I'm saying it's a trap, because it's easy to come in and maybe you get some influence and maybe you get some impact when you go to this first level, but then it gets progressively harder to go up. And I've seen many careers where people get frustrated because they can't make the progress because there's simply not enough open spots. And at some point, if you're in a good company, you have a lot more qualified people that you could move forward, but you know, you can't. And so, and everybody expects certain cadence of progression in their career. On the technical side, on the IC side, there could be 5 technical leads working with a team of 100 people and covering different aspects of it. So it's somehow more fluidity and more opportunity. So what I do usually do, I tell people to stay on the technical side. Now, management is, you know, if you want to do management is about people. So everything, you know, although even IC work, you have to have empathy and work with others. On a management is you have responsibility for people. So are you willing and would you enjoy working with people? And it's all about establishing those personal relationships with your reports, understanding and moving forward at every different level of management. I think we're running out of time, Karin, right?
Yes. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Thanks to everyone who attended. This will go on our YouTube channel, so make sure to subscribe there. It will come out in the next few days. And Vanja, again, thanks for being my guest. Hopefully we'll see you again on some future event.
Thank you all, and thanks to all the audience following Ti od Makedonije. Приятно.
Ciao, ciao.